Chapter 3. Softly I slipped out of my room. As was her custom, Mrs. Tupper had retired early to her bedchamber, where even if she were still awake, the deaf old soul could not possibly hear my careful tread as I exited. Since I kept my habit hidden in the bedstead, I felt quite certain Mrs. Tupper had no idea that a second person, so to speak, a rather gaunt, nocturnal sister of charity, was lodging in a spare room, along with a nice young secretary girl, Mrs. Meshel. I had to feel my way down the dark stairs, for of course, in this sorry house, nearly a hovel, there was no gas laid on. Fumbling for the keyhole in the dark, I unlocked the front door with my latchkey, stepped outside, relocked the door behind me, then walked quickly away to lessen the likelihood that any chance midnight watcher should discover where I lived. At random, taking a different route than last night or the night before, I strode down shadowy, narrow courts, ill lit by gas street lamps. Not for the East End, where the carriage, lamps, and flamboy of the well-to-do, nor the brand-new electric features of the very rich. Here the feeble and wavering lights floated or rather drowned in a sea of brown smut. London crouched frigid in its own peculiar choking way. Here midnight's chill was made of chimney soot, coal fumes, wood smoke, and dank disease wafting up from the Thames. It was as if one swam in a fog colder than ice, never yet frozen, forever soaked through one's clothing and into one's bones. Such thick and freezing weather had driven indoors all folk who had anywhere to take refuge. Even on the stairways at a lodging house, one would find vagabonds sleeping. Poor folk who had no other field tonight were burning straw stolen from dung heaps behind stables, and might not live to see morning. When I had judged I had left my own lodgings far enough behind, I stepped into a dark gap between houses and lit an oil lantern I had brought with me. Already stiffening with cold, my fingers could barely manipulate the match. One might well wonder why a young lady of gentle breeding would go out under such circumstances. I myself did not fully understand why I felt compelled to wander the night. I am perhaps a bit of a monomaniac, driven always to quest, venture, search, and seek, find out, find things, find people. Tonight, anyone who might need help to survive. Into my habit, as well as the heavy wool mantle I wore over it, I had sewed many deep pockets, stocked with items I might need. Candle stubs and wooden matches, shillings and pence, warm knitted socks and caps and mittens, apples, biscuits, a flask of brandy. I carried a homemade blanket over one arm, in the other hand I lifted the lantern. Wearing black fur-lined gloves, I held my light high and began to search the back ways and byways, alert for any hint of danger, any sounds of angry altercation or screaming or footsteps behind me. I listened also for the sound of anyone crying, and before very long I heard it. A low, dull sort of sobbing, reflexive as if the person had given up, weeping only to breathe. Guided by that lament, for my lantern showed me only a few paces by street stone on foot, before all vanished into sooty fog, I found an old woman crouched in a doorway, trying to get warm herself in a shawl that covered only her head and shoulders. As I approached, she heard my footsteps, and she tried to muffle her weeping with her hands, afraid. But then she sobbed aloud again, this time in relief, recognizing me. Many such folk knew me now. Sister, she whispered. Sister of the streets. One thin arm faltered towards me. Mutely, for the sister never spoke or made a sound, I swept down on her like a big, skinny black head on a chick, I suppose, wrapping her in my blanket. A crude thing. I made my blankets out of hunks of old cloth sewn together, because any coverings of better quality would have been stolen from those who needed them most. The woman's face, lifted to the lantern's light, was perhaps not elderly after all, only harrowed by hardship, her scrawny body stunted by rickets and hunger. Was she a widow or a spinster, turned away from a common lodging-house for lack of eightpence, or had she been driven into the night by her husband's drunken blows? Knowing that I would never know, I slipped thick, knitted stockings over her bare feet, and brought out one of my pockets as an item I had. I believe invented a sizable tin, tightly stuffed to the brim, with wadded paper into which I had poured paraffin. Lighting a wooden match, I laid it atop this odd sort of portable fire and set it in the doorway beside her, where it started to burn, flaring like an overlarge candle, putting off a good deal of heat. It would last only an hour or so, but long enough for her to warm herself, and hid enough, I hoped, so that it would not attract any unwelcome company to her. I gave her an apple, some biscuits, and a meat pie that had come from a baker, not a street vendor, and therefore might be made of good wholesome meat, not intermixed with dog or cat. Thank you so much, sister. The woman could not seem to stop weeping, but she would, I thought, after I went away. Quickly I slipped her a few shillings, money enough to buy her food and lodging for several days, but not so much as she was likely to be killed for it. Then standing back, I turned away, hoping she understood that there was nothing more I could do for her. Sister of the streets, God bless you, she called after me. Her gratitude made me feel like a fraud, a farce unworthy, for there were many, too many like her, and I could never possibly find them all. Striding on my own, I myself shivered with cold and with fear, listening. Tipsy, singing, and drunken yells floated faintly to my ears from the next street. A public house, still open. I wondered how this was allowed. Surely the authorities. My attention diverted. Too late. I sensed a presence behind me. Some small sound, perhaps the chuff of shoe leather against the frozen mud and crushed stone of the street, perhaps the hiss of an evil breath. But even as I opened my startled mouth to gasp, even as I turned to leap, something struck me, seized me around the neck. Something unseen, behind me, fearsomely strong, gripping tighter, tight. Not a human grasp, some narrow doom, serpentine, constricting, biting into my throat. I could not think, and never even reached for my own dagger. I only reacted, dropping my lantern as both my hands flew up to the claw at the thing, whatever it was, tormenting my neck. But already I felt my breath cutting off, my body thrashing in pain, my mouth stretching in a voiceless scream, my vision dimming to darkness, and I knew I was going to die. It seems to me that I next grew aware of a light in the darkness, but not a kindly light. This was orange, dancing, diabolical. Blinking my way out of blackness, I felt the cold, harsh street beneath me, and saw that I lay nearly in a fire. A pool of oil leaking from a broken lantern burned merrily. In that gleeful glow, 3 or 4 men peered down at me. Very blurred, that memory, blurred by night and fog, by my confusion and pain, by my veil, as blurred as their drunken voices. Is she dead? What sort of old cad would garrot the sister? Maybe one of them foreign anarchists so don't like religion. Didn't you see him? Is she breathing? Bending over me, one of them lifted my veil. I think he looked at my face for a moment before I struck his hands away, before my shock at such impropriety roused me from my swoon. No, one can hardly say I had tumbled down in a faint, not in any delicate lady's sense of the word. Surely, if one is strangled half dead, one cannot be accused of fainting. In any event, blinking my way out of unconsciousness took a moment or two, which I remembered imperfectly. I believe I struck out at the man who was lifting my veil, yanking it back down over my face again as I rolled away from the fire and wavered to my feet. Here, missus, what's your hurry? Steady on your old horse. Watch your sister, you fool. Hands reached towards me, but rejecting their offers of help, for they were staggering drunk, whereas I was merely staggering. I fled. Retreated, as the military word would say, in bad order, without ever having drawn a weapon. In a panic of dry sobbing, indeed, I hardly knew how I blundered my own way back to my lodging. But somehow, eventually, I reached my room, where, trembling, I lit every oil lamp, every candle, and stirred up the hearth fire, wastefully throwing on wood and coal until I roused a blaze of warmth and light in the night. I threw myself into my armchair and sat trying to stop panting, for each breath hurt my throat. Closing my mouth, I swallowed again and again, trying to swallow my humiliation, as well as my pain. Despite the fire, I still felt cold, with more than just night's frost, chilled to the marrow of my soul. I needed to get into bed. I staggered up. I began to unbutton my high collar. My trembling fingers felt something hanging around my neck. Some alien presence, long and smooth, supple. It was as if a snake clung there. Despite the pain to my injured throat, I cried out as I snatched and clawed at the thing, fumbling it off me and flinging it to the floor. There, on my hearthrug, it lay. The garrote. I had heard they were made of wire, but this one was fashioned instead of some sort of smooth white cord knotted to a stick of wood. Caught in that wood, I saw a cluster of brown hair, my own, wrenched from my head as the grotto twisted the device tighter and tighter around my neck. Swaying where I stood, I had to close my eyes for a moment, realizing that only my high collar, stiffened with whalebone, had kept me alive. London's constables wore high-collared tunics for the same reason. How astonishing and fearsome to think that such a simple device could terrorize an entire metropolis, even the police. Fearsome, also, and shameful to realize that not any courage or wit of my own had saved me. Forgetting my weapon like a bumbling fool, I had kicked and clawed, no better than any other preyed upon female. Collar or no collar, I might be dead had those drunkards not happened along. Yes, I decided, indeed, they must have interpreted the garrote. Why else would he have left his lovingly fashioned apparatus around my neck? Trembling badly, I forced myself to open my eyes again, studying that loathsome device. Lovingly fashioned, indeed, the stick of polished malacca wood might have been taken from a gentleman's cane, hardly the sort of implement one would expect of a street thug. And the cord, a stay lacing, that is to say, the lacing from a lady's corset. Sudden sickness lurched through me, and with it a blaze of anger. Snatching up the foul-minded, insolent thing, I flung it into the fire.